There I am. Okay. So there we go. Okay, got it. So let me pull this up out of the way. Okay, well, I love that dog show. That's, like I said, I love dogs. So, well, welcome back, all of you. We're finishing up the series of presentations today. We seem like we've been on this for a long time. We started it last fall when COVID was at its height and none of us could get anywhere. And so Pastor Dwayne and I just started doing some things here at the township. And then Kayla was nice enough to ask me to come on board with Arrow and do the presentations aboard. But next week, before I start on the end of this week's, I want to tell you a little bit about next week. We're going to start a new series of presentations. And if you're a fan of Pastor Dwayne, if you watch his Bible study, I think you might be interested in this. I'm going to go back to my roots, to my old love, which is ancient history. And I know that sounds a little boring, but it's really not. In fact, it's pretty darn interesting at times. But I'm going to do a little bit of a switcheroo this time. I'm going to teach the class or do the presentation like I've always wanted to do, which is basically where the Bible intersects with ancient history. I'm going to try to highlight the Bible. I'm very much involved with that, and I think that the Bible is a lot of times misunderstood in terms of ancient history. And so we're going to try to intersect this. I'm going to work with Dwayne, and we're going to kind of supplement what he's doing, as well as inform and hopefully affirm, some of the lessons of the Bible. It's not going to be a Bible class. I'm not a theologian, but I'm a historian, and it's basically going to be the history of the ancient world intersecting with the Bible. And I think it might be something that some of you might be interested in. So with that being said, let's go on and start finishing up this set of lessons, the end of the Old West. Absolutely one of my very favorite paintings ever. Visions of Yesterday by William Robinson Lee. I had this print hanging in my office where I worked, and then in the office of my home for almost 50 years. I love it. You can see there that it's a painting of an old Indian who's plowing the ground, looking down at the buffalo skull. But if you look real closely at the clouds are in the formation of an old buffalo hunt. And I can't think of a better painting to end this series of presentations on, because it definitely indicates the transition of the Old West to the New West. And it's a sad painting, but at the same time, I think it's a beautiful painting. So what I'm going to talk about today is three men. I'm going to talk about, I call them the three M's. Men that have kind of been forgotten in history, but yet really show the transition of the Old West into modern society, maybe better than anybody else. One of them was a lover of nature, a man by the name of John Muir. I suspect some of you have probably heard of John Muir. He had a vision of preserving the most beautiful lands in the West, and he influenced a whole nation, as well as a president, Teddy Roosevelt, to enact legislation to do just that. The second man was a man by the name of William Mulholland, who realized that if the relatively small city of Los Angeles was going to grow, it needed water. And so he figured out a way to get it there. And of course, we now know that Los Angeles and the suburbs around it are the biggest megalopolis in America. New York City is bigger, but when you count all the suburbs around and all, by far and away, Los Angeles is the biggest, what we call megalopolis in the United States and one of them in the world. Finally, the last M was Tom Mix, a man who became probably the most famous movie star of the early silent era and made him a hero to almost every man, woman, child in America. So let's look at these three men and their lives and see how they show how we kind of move from the horse to the horseless carriage, because that's the way that's what we're talking about, a transition from life. I love this photo. You can see the guy sitting here on his old buckboard, and he's kind of stopped in the street because all around him are horseless carriages. And again, that kind of shows how the West had changed. So what about John Muir? Well, John Muir was born in Scotland, 1858, immigrated to America, 1838, immigrated to America in the U.S. About 1849 as a young man, moved out to Wisconsin, and he absolutely loved the nature. Wisconsin was pretty wild then. But he also became kind of an inventor of strange little machines and all, never invented anything important. But in the process of doing that, he had a serious accident and went blind. Fortunately for him, he regained his eyesight. And as often happens when people have a calamity like that, it changes their lives, and it changed him. He decided he was not going to waste a moment longer dabbling with simple little stuff. He was going to see nature and live with nature the rest of his life because that's what he loved. And so what did he do? He walked 1,000 miles down to the Gulf of Mexico, caught a ship down to Panama, walked across the isthmus, caught another ship, sailed up to California, arrived at San Francisco in 1868, and lived there the rest of his life in California, and became the premier naturalist of America. His name is still synonymous with nature in America. And this is a very young John Muir, would have been about the time that he got to California or so. So what did he do? Well, first summer he was there, he went out west into California and went into the Yosemite Valley to see the Sierra Nevada mountains, and he absolutely fell in love. He said to himself, this is where I want to live the rest of my life. So he built him a cabin, started herding sheep, and began to write books and pamphlets and stories about what he thought was the most beautiful spot on earth. And he got an immediate following to the point that people all over the country started visiting him. People like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, and later on Teddy Roosevelt. They would come and live with him for a few days in his cabin. And he just developed a huge following because of his love of nature. And this was really big at that time in America. He soon began to travel all over the world. He married, continued to write books, went on the lecture tour, not necessarily to make money, just enough to live. All that was important to him was preserving the beauty of the world, because he knew, he could see the way it was going, that we were going to lose some of it if we didn't do something about it. And he persuaded a whole generation of politicians to take action to preserve some of the most beautiful spots in America. Here's a photo of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt standing on the mountains in Yosemite National Park. If you've been to Yosemite, you'll notice Yosemite Falls down to the below Teddy Roosevelt there. You can see, that. So, really an influential man. It's so influential that he's generally called the father of the national parks in America. 1890, he convinced Congress to pass an act making Yosemite National Park a national park. And then he went on ahead and lobbied them and also founded the Sierra Club, which is still in existence and is probably the premier naturalist society in America. Just extremely important in preservation of nature in America. And he went ahead and was able to convince Congress to make other areas natural parks, Sequoia, Mount Rainier, Petrified Forest, the Grand Canyon. All of these are national parks today because of John Muir. Had he not done this, I'm not for sure we would have these today as national parks. I can assure you they would not be in the condition that they're in today. He was really instrumental in preserving the natural landscape of the West, and that's why he's called the father of the National Park Service. 1914, he died, the most famous, influential naturalist and conservationist in American history, and probably still is. He was that important. I love this screen here. God never made an ugly landscape. All that the sun shines on is beautiful, so long as it is wild. What a great quote, and what a credo to live by for sure. So, who is the second M? William Mulholland. Well, you couldn't have found a more opposite person from John Muir than William Mulholland, and yet his influence on the West has been almost as important as John Muir's, but in a much different way. William Mulholland was a young man from Ireland in 1855, came to New York City around 1870, went out west, arrived in a very young Los Angeles, where he became a ditch digger for the water company. Now, Los Angeles in 1877 maybe had a few thousand people, so wasn't much of a ditch digging going on there. But he began to work for there, and as Los Angeles grew, he worked himself up into becoming the water superintendent's job. He held that job for 43 years, clear into the first part of the 20th century. Now, about 1900 or so, he looked around and he saw that Los Angeles was growing huge. It had already reached 100,000 people, which isn't big now, but he realized how big Los Angeles could get. But there was a problem. Los Angeles didn't have any natural water supply. It didn't have the artesian wells that some cities have or some regions have. The aquifers weren't present to be able to drill down and get much water. So the result was he knew that if Los Angeles was going to grow, that he was going to have to find water for Los Angeles. So here is William Mulholland. You've probably heard the name, Mulholland Drive, Mulholland Falls. It's a name that's all over Los Angeles if you've ever been there, but you probably never really associated it necessarily with anybody. But that's William Mulholland. So he looked around and he began to look for a water source. And he reached the Sierra Nevada mountains about 200 miles away in some place called the Owens Valley. And he thought, man, this is perfect. It's a snow-fed river from the mountains. It always has water because there's always snow in the Sierra Nevadas. And if I could figure out a way to get that water from the Owens River down to Los Angeles would grow. So he set about developing a system to get the water there. And he began to buy right away for land and water rights. And I'll be honest, some people think that he did some pretty shady deals. He was not necessarily a, how should I say this? He was kind of like a robber baron. He would get land and water rights any way he could. I'm not going to say how necessarily, but some of them were probably less than honorable, to say the least. But the point of it is, he got enough land and water rights that by the time around 1905 or so, he had secured enough land rights to build the aqueduct. The problem is he needed money to do it. So he went around persuading the citizens of Los Angeles that if they would pass a $23 million bond issue, that he would build the aqueduct from the Owens River to Los Angeles and provide them with water. Now, folks, you got to think about this. $23 million bond issue is a big bond issue today. We're talking 120 years ago. I mean, this was really a whole lot of money. And Los Angeles was really taking a risk in doing this. But they also knew that if they were going to grow, they were going to need that water. And so they passed it. And over the next 8 years, he had a crew of thousands building the aqueduct system from the mountains and deserts, over the mountains and deserts of California to Los Angeles. One of the greatest engineering marvels of the age. It was done in 1915, and it immediately began to transform Los Angeles into the metropolis that we know it of today. Here's a photograph and a newspaper article of the time. There's the Owens Aqueduct coming over one of the mountains, and there's a newspaper article, Glorious Mountain River now flows to Los Angeles Gate. It saved Los Angeles. Didn't save it, but he made it. That's for sure. Now, that all sounds good and fine. And here's a photograph, or pardon me, a map of the original Owens Aqueduct here. And these were some of the later aqueducts that were built. There's several of them now all over Los Angeles, all over California. The Colorado Aqueduct, which brought water to San Diego. And up here, you've got them coming down into Sacramento and this area in San Francisco. So aqueducts are kind of a commonplace thing in California. Now, as I was saying, not everybody liked what he did, particularly the people who lived in the Owens Valley. The Owens Valley was almost like a paradise. I can only imagine what John Muir thought about all this. The Owens Valley was a beautiful place. It was full of orchards and trees and farms. And the problem was it dried up because Mulholland took all the water away and brought it to Los Angeles. Result was that their land began to die, and they weren't happy about it. So some of them fought back with violence. May 21st, 1924, some of them actually blew up the aqueduct at a critical point and stopped the water supply for a while. Eventually, they got it back on. What was Mulholland's response? He said that sabotage continued for months and Mulholland received hundreds of death threats, to which his only comment was, he regretted the demise of so many of the valley's orchard trees because now there were no longer enough trees to hang all the troublemakers who lived there. Wow. Does that give you a clue about the kind of man that Mulholland was? But folks, again, his impact on California has just been unbelievable. You know, he really made Southern California what it is today as far as cities. Eventually, of course, Mulholland and his advocates won. The farmers lost, and eventually they've kind of went away. Here is a photograph of the bombing of the aqueduct. You can see the aqueduct was blown up there and, stopped the water supply for some time to Los Angeles. So you would think that Mulholland would be a real famous figure in California, and particularly Los Angeles. Unfortunately, his career kind of ended tragically for him, as not to mention a whole lot of other people. March 12th, in I can't see it from my screen here. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but part of the dam that he had built collapsed and sent a 15 billion gallon surge of water 2 miles wide, 70 miles long, 75 feet tall to the sea, destroyed everything in its path. It was the worst civil disaster in the history of the United States at that time. And this was one of the dams that broke that he had built to contain the water to build up water supplies. And over 500 people lost their lives, and for weeks, bodies were washing up on the beaches of Los Angeles. And Mulholland was just absolutely disgraced. He was forced to retire. and he actually died in disgrace at the age of 80, not realizing totally what he had done by creating the greatest megalopolis in the West, or for that matter of fact, anywhere in the world, really, in the Los Angeles area. This is a photograph of the dam that broke and the results of it here. So it was a really huge disaster in American history. And again, we don't hear much about it anymore, but it was very important. So finally, the last M. We'll end on a little bit of a happy note, okay? In the 1880s, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show showed up to Driftwood, Pennsylvania. And a young boy was sitting out in the audience by the name of Tom Mix. And Tom Mix decided right then and there he was going to be a cowboy. Ended up being the greatest Western movie actor of the early 20th century. Not just Western movie actor, the highest paid actor of the early 20th century. He and Charlie Chaplin and some of these people were just the most important people in early Hollywood. Now, Tom Mix is a kind of a strange character. It's really hard to figure out exactly what he did. It seemed like every time he heard of a big event, he added it to his life's history. And the result was it's kind of hard to separate fiction from fact with Tom Mix. Pardon me while I get a drink. So really a hard thing to separate fiction from fact with him. But that people didn't care. They loved him. And so he just became an iconic movie star of the early 20th century in America. And this is Tom Mix. I bet some millions remember seeing him on TV shows or maybe at the serials at the movies. That's where I first saw him, was when they would replay his serials in the movies. He did make some talkies. They weren't all silent, but majority of them were. So what was the legend? Well, if you believe everything Tom Mix told us, he was with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders when they charged up San Juan Hill. He also said that he fought in the Philippines and then participated in the Boxer Rebellion. He also fought in the Boer War, he said, down in South Africa. Came back home, was a Texas Ranger for a while, and then a Deputy U.S. Marshal, and finally ended up working on the famous 101 Ranch out in Oklahoma, where he became a very good friend of Will Rogers. Now, how much of that is true? Nobody knows for sure. His early life is kind of a fog. He probably did some of these things to a degree. We're pretty sure he was in the Spanish-American War. We don't know if he was with the Rough Riders. He maybe was stationed in the Philippines. We have no reason to believe he was in the Boxer Rebellion. He did serve as a law enforcement officer, and there's indications that he maybe was an honorary Texas Ranger. We don't know for sure exactly what his background was, but we know that he came across as all this to the people. By 1904, he was a pretty famous person, participated in the World's Fair, had participated in Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration parade, and someone happened to see him and thought, boy, this guy would make a really good movie star. So happened that the famous Western movie star of the time, William S. Hart, the first Western movie star, was getting a little old, and he was having a hard time doing some of the things he needed to do. And someone said, hey, why don't we bring Tom Mix to Hollywood and make him a movie star? And so that's what they did. And boy, did he ever become a movie star. Huge presence in Hollywood. Ended up making 326 silent movies, was making over $18,000 a week for many, many years while he was at the top of his game. Boy, I can't even imagine. $18,000 a year used to be a really good sum for me. I can't imagine what $18,000 a week was. And this was back in the 20s when $18,000 was really a whole lot of money. He had a sprawling mansion in Hollywood, uh, had fast cars, lived a life of luxury. He didn't make the transition to talkies very well. He did make some talkies. He made mostly serials. And like I said, that's where I first got my introduction to him. But boy, he was good looking. He could do everything. He could rope. He could ride a horse. And by the way, he had a very famous trick pony by the name of Tony that got top billing with him and made him all this made him the most popular movie star of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And this is Tom Mix's house in Los Angeles. It's an old postcard. This was a couple of his movie posters. This was the car that he was killed in. He was killed in a car wreck in 1940 out in Arizona. And someone later on purchased the car and rebuilt it and restored it. And that's Tom Mix's actual Cord vehicle. Wow, that thing would be worth some money, I would imagine, to say the least. So, what an important legacy. He brought the big screen heroism to life. He did what Buntline and all these other novelists couldn't. He allowed everyone to be able to see Buffalo Bill and George Custer and Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and Wild Bill Hickok, you name them. All these legends of the Old West he portrayed up on the big screen. And he was just instantaneously famous. He fulfilled a quest that every man, woman, and child in America was seeking, the heroic Westerner. Everybody wanted to be a cowboy, every little boy. And like I said, he didn't make a very good transition to the talkies and unfortunately died a pretty tragic death in an automobile accident in 1940. So these three guys, John Muir, William Mulholland, Tom Mix, the three M's, to me, they signify the transition from the Old West to the New West. And always end with a book and a movie to recommend. And excellent book by the man by the name of Donald Worcester. I've read it, Passion for Nature, The Life of John Muir. Great book. As far as movies, in the 1990s, Tom Selleck made a remake of Monty Walsh. Monty Walsh was based on a book written by the same guy that wrote Shane. And it's a story about a cowboy that is seeing the life he lived in. And he doesn't like it very well. It's a good movie. It's humorous in a lot of spots. But it really kind of gives you a glimpse of the end of the cowboy era. And it's really good. Of course, I think Tom Selleck is good in just about anything he does. So, one more slide and we're done with the Old West. I'm going to say adios from Tom, Tony, and yes, that's me. That's me in my little cowboy shirt back when I was about 6 years old. I got to tell you my story. Okay, I've waited to the very end to tell you this story. I was about 2 weeks old when my brother, who was about 4, had to go to the doctor. He was ill. So mom took him to the doctor and I was just an infant little baby and she held in his arms. And the doctor was looking at him. He said, "Hey, what's your little brother's name?" Well, he didn't have any idea what my name was. He could have, he didn't know. I was only 2 weeks old. He said the first thing that popped in his mind, Tony. Now, that's not my real name, and I'm not going to tell you what my real name is. But when my mother got back to the house, she said, "Jim, what were you thinking? Why did you call your little brother Tony?" And he said, "Well, I couldn't think of anything else." And she said, "Well, where'd you come up with Tony?" He said, "Well, it's Tom Mix's horse, Mom. Everybody knows Tom Mix is Tony." And it stuck. And from that point on, nobody ever called me anything but Tony. In fact, my school records had my name down as Tony. And I had to go back right before I graduated and have my school records change my legal name because I realized that that was going to follow me the rest of my life. So anyway, that's how I got my name. I got my name from Tom Mix's horse. And I thought that was probably about as good a way to end this series of presentations as I could do it. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned a little bit about the Old West. I hope you've had fun. And like I said, next week we're going to start a whole new adventure. And I think if you tune in, you might get interested in that too. So from Tom Mix and Tony, adios. And we'll see you next week, hopefully.
We've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good, good, good. Both Tonys are good looking there.
Uh-huh. They are.
Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
That
So now you know I'm named after a horse.
That's funny.
Okay. Well, we'll see you next week, okay?
Yeah. At this time? At what time?